The shelves are empty. Walk into any provincial liquor store from Winnipeg to Victoria right now, and you will not find a single bottle of American bourbon, American wine, or American beer. Not one. This is not a supply chain problem. This is not an accident. This is a planned act of economic fighting, and it is working. In the first week of April, Canadian premiers across multiple provinces took every American alcohol product off government-controlled shelves. Manitoba's premier, Wab Kinew, did not use soft words. "They started it," he said. "We're going to finish it." That's not a diplomatic statement. That's a strong declaration, and it came in direct response to what economists are now calling the most reckless tariff attack on a close friend in modern trade history. Here's the line nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. Donald Trump started unprovoked tariffs on Canada, America's largest trading partner, and now his own trade officials are the ones throwing a public fit because Canadians stopped stocking their liquor stores with American products. Think about that. The country that started it is angry about the response. U.S. Trade Representative JamiesonGreer said this week that America is at the end of its rope. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick called the alcohol ban insulting and disrespectful. And somewhere in a Manitoba government office, a premier read those quotes and smiled. Because when you poke the hockey player, this is what you get. If you live anywhere near the US-Canada border, if you work in auto parts, forestry, agriculture, or steel, this matters to your paycheck. Not in a made-up way, but directly. The tariffs hitting Canadian exports are landing on real jobs, and this script is going to show you exactly how, by whom, and what the next 90 days look like. Meet the person this whole story is really about. Not the premiers, not the trade representatives. Call her Marie, a third-generation auto worker in Windsor, Ontario, whose plant ships components across the Detroit River every single morning. She did not vote on tariffs. She did not write trade policy, but she wakes up every week not knowing whether her production line still makes financial sense. Marie is the real subject of this story, and we're going to keep coming back to her. We know what we know because multiple sources across this story are on record, or nearly on record. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew spoke publicly and in detail. Former Quebec Premier Jean Charest, now serving his second term on the Canada-US Economic Advisory Council, sat for an interview and confirmed the facts and strategic picture we're working with. Former Finance Minister and UK High Commissioner Ralph Goodale, freshly appointed to the same council, added legal and institutional weight. And the US side? They confirmed everything through their own anger. When Greer says the US is at the end of its rope, that is an admission that Canada's countermeasure is working. The Council meets for its first meeting Monday in Ottawa. Prime Minister Mark Carney rebuilt it from scratch, or nearly from scratch. He kept Charest, swapped out most of the Trudeau-era faces, and loaded it with private sector heavyweights, including Tracy Robinson of CN Rail, who also chairs the Business Council of Canada. This is not a committee for show. This is a war cabinet with strong connections. 3 separate officials used the same word in their public comments this week. Uncertainty. Not tariffs, not retaliation. Uncertainty. That word is doing enormous work, and we are going to explain it. It is early April 2025. The room in Ottawa, where the Advisory Council will meet Monday morning, is already prepared. Documents are printed, briefing notes have been reviewed. Around the table will sit former premiers, current rail executives, a former finance minister who once negotiated with London, and the collective question in that room will be, what do you do when the person across the table keeps moving the table? Because that is what the Trump administration has done with every interaction since January. They set terms. Canada adjusted. They reset the terms. Canada adjusted again. They introduced new sectoral tariffs on steel, and did it, as Ralph Goodale confirmed, without giving anyone a heads up. Changed the goalpost, didn't tell the other team, just blew the whistle and pointed to a new line. In the Ottawa room, Jean Charest knows this pattern. He sat across from American negotiators before. He knows the real feel of a trade standoff, the coffee that goes cold because nobody wants to be the first one to reach for it. He's seen the body language of a delegation that was told to stall. And this week, when he said, "We're not trying to rag the puck," he was sending a message not to the cameras, but to the American side. We are not the ones running out the clock. You are. But here is the psychological truth behind that quote. The thing Charest didn't say directly, but that his careful phrasing revealed. Canada is, in fact, quite comfortable with the passage of time right now. The Supreme Court ruling in January weakened the American position. The midterms are approaching. The U.S. private sector is screaming privately about what these tariffs are doing to their own supply chains. Time, right now, is a Canadian asset, and everyone in that room knows it. The moment Greer said enforcement action in response to the alcohol ban, he tipped the hand. You don't threaten enforcement when you're winning. Receipt 1. Before these tariffs, Canada was purchasing more goods from the United States than the UK, France, China, and Japan combined. Read that again. More than those 4 countries combined. Ralph Goodale confirmed this on record. The U.S. does not have a trade relationship with Canada the way it has a trade relationship with, say, Vietnam. This is an economic marriage, a deeply connected, decades-long, codependent partnership where supply chains run back and forth across the border, sometimes multiple times before a product is finished. Trump's tariffs did not hit an enemy. They hit a factory floor in Michigan that needed a part made in Ontario, but that's only part of it. Receipt 2. The sectoral tariffs, the Section 232 measures on steel and aluminum, have a specific and documented impact. Canadian steel exports employ tens of thousands of workers in regions that don't make headlines. Not Toronto, not Montreal, but the mid-sized industrial cities where a mill is the largest employer in the county. When the U.S. reapplied and reinterpreted those steel tariffs only a few weeks ago, as Charest confirmed, it landed without warning on businesses that had already restructured to comply with the previous version of the rules. That's not trade policy. That's a trap. And the people caught in it are not lobbyists. They're shift workers. Think about Marie in Windsor. Her plant already absorbed 1 round of supply chain shocks when the USMCA came into force. She watched her employer renegotiate contracts, retool production runs, adapt. Now, again, the rules changed overnight. The cost didn't disappear. It shifted to her employer's margins, to her overtime hours, to the quiet conversation in the break room about whether the next contract cycle includes her job. Here's where it gets worse. Receipt 3. The alcohol ban is not just symbolic, it is economically precise. Government liquor boards in Canadian provinces control retail alcohol sales. When premiers decided to retaliate, they had a direct lever that required no legislation, no court challenge, no parliamentary vote. They just stopped ordering. The American spirits and wine industry, which exports hundreds of millions of dollars annually into Canada, felt it immediately. And because this is an industry with a powerful domestic lobby in the U.S., the pain went straight to Washington. That's why Lutnick is calling it insulting. That's why Greer is threatening enforcement. The bar owners and distillers and distributors who are now calling congressional offices are not calling about softwood lumber or steel quotas. They're calling about their products sitting in warehouses with nowhere to go. Receipt 4. The July 1st USMCA review deadline is, by near universal acknowledgement, going to be missed. Both Charest and Goodale confirmed this independently. What the mainstream coverage is getting wrong is the framing. Missing the deadline is not a crisis. The deal doesn't expire, trade continues. But missing the deadline does extend the period of what Goodale called the uncertainty tax, the invisible, immeasurable cost of not knowing. Every business that is holding off on a capital investment, every manufacturer that won't sign a multi-year supply contract, Every executive sitting on a decision that requires two-country confidence, they are all paying the uncertainty tax right now. It doesn't show up in a tariff line. It doesn't show up in a customs document. It shows up in GDP 6 months from now. You've just absorbed a lot of data. Here is why it matters to you personally, right now, in plain terms. The tariffs, the bans, the missed deadlines, they are not abstractions. They are already in the price of the goods on your store shelves, already in the hesitation of your employer before the next hiring cycle, already in the funding cut to the infrastructure project in your town that got quietly delayed because the federal government is spending its reserves on emergency trade support for the forestry sector. The economic machinery that runs your daily life is being deliberately destabilized by policy choices made in Washington and Ottawa. You are inside this story, whether you ask to be or not. Here's what every other outlet is missing. They are covering this as a negotiation drama. Who's at the table? Who's not at the table? Who stormed out? Who extended an olive branch? That framing is wrong. This is not a negotiation, not yet. What is actually happening right now is a calibration exercise. Canada is discovering in real time which American pressure points respond to which Canadian countermeasures. The alcohol ban is not the end game. It is a test, and so far the test is producing useful results. When Greer says enforcement and Lutnick says insulting, Canada learns that this lever works. That knowledge is more valuable than any single concession. Let me translate the phrase, "We're not trying to rag the puck," into plain English with consequences attached. In hockey, ragging the puck means controlling possession, not to score, but to run out the clock. Charest used this phrase to signal that Canada is not stalling, but the subtext, which every Canadian in that room understood, is this: Canada doesn't need to stall because the clock is already running against the United States. Midterms are coming. The U.S. Federal Reserve is watching inflation data that tariffs are making worse. The American private sector has begun what one trade observer described as an increasingly loud whisper campaign inside the Republican caucus. Canada doesn't need to run out the clock. The clock is doing it for them. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Do you think Canada should offer additional concessions to start the USMCA talks, or hold the line and let the clock run? I want to know what you think happens next. What you are about to understand is the actual strategic architecture beneath this trade war, and nobody in the mainstream coverage has laid it out this clearly. The first analytical move, the Trump administration's trade strategy, is built on the assumption that disruption creates leverage. The theory is that if you introduce enough uncertainty, the other side will make concessions just to restore stability. This playbook works sometimes. It worked in renegotiating NAFTA into USMCA. It has worked in extracting short-term gestures from trading partners before, but it has a specific failure condition. It stops working when the target country has a government that has explicitly told its own population that chaos is the opponent's weapon. Mark Carney ran an election campaign on exactly that message. He won, which means the Canadian population has already been psychologically protected against the disruption as leverage playbook. In plain language, the move that usually works on Ottawa isn't working this time, and Washington doesn't have a backup play. The second analytical move, notice what the Trump administration has not done. They have not invoked the formal USMCA dispute resolution mechanism. They have not filed at the WTO. They have not called for emergency bilateral consultations under the treaty's own terms. Every official action they have taken has been unilateral. Tariffs declared by executive order, complaints delivered in press conferences, threats issued through television interviews. This absence of institutional process is not an oversight. It is a choice. Because formal dispute resolution is a process with rules, timelines, and binding outcomes, and the current administration does not want binding outcomes. They want continuous leverage. The moment you file a formal complaint, you lose the ability to keep threatening. What that actually tells you is the United States knows it cannot win a formal legal proceeding on these tariffs. Ralph Goodale said it directly. They are, in fact, illegal. The third analytical move, the advisory council that Carney rebuilt, is not a communication exercise, it is a mobilization architecture. Charest said explicitly that the Council's job going forward is to help remobilize people at all levels, premiers, mayors, people in the private sector, to speak directly to their American counterparts. This is Canada building a parallel lobbying operation inside the United States. CN Rail CEO doesn't just run trains, she sits on boards, attends conferences, and has dinner with the kinds of American executives who have direct access to the Republican caucus. What that actually tells you is Canada is not waiting for Washington to come to the table. Canada is going around Washington directly to the people whose businesses are bleeding. The doctrine to take away from this section: asymmetric patience beats symmetric escalation. When one side has a president with a 24-hour news cycle ego, and the other side has a parliamentary majority with a 4-year mandate, time is not a neutral factor. Former Saskatchewan trade economist on record, the Section 232 tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum have no defensible legal basis under USMCA. These are not national security measures. They are leveraged tools wearing a legal costume. One sentence of analysis: when the costume becomes the story, the costume becomes the liability. Ralph Goodale, former finance minister and high commissioner to the United Kingdom, speaking this week. Canada buys more from the United States than the UK, France, China, and Japan combined. We are not just another trading partner like 190 others. One sentence of analysis: when your most loyal customer starts looking at alternative suppliers, the relationship has changed permanently. Jean Charest, former Premier of Quebec and current Advisory Council member. There is absolutely no one serious in the United States, no one who is saying scrap this deal or tear it apart. What people are actually saying is maintain the deal. One sentence of analysis: the political consensus for USMCA inside the US is stronger than the administration's posture suggests, and the Council's job is to make that consensus audible. And when people on opposite sides of this issue agree on one thing, you pay attention. To be fair, and this analysis requires it, there is a legitimate argument on the American side of this equation. The United States has raised documented concerns about Chinese goods being routed through Canada to circumvent American tariffs. That is a real issue and not a fabrication. Canada's digital services tax, which Ottawa later agreed to pause, did target American technology companies in a way that felt retaliatory to Washington, even before the current tariff fight began. And from a pure negotiation standpoint, there is a reasonable argument that Canada's refusal to offer any additional concessions as a precondition for talks is itself a form of stubbornness. Those counter-arguments are real. But here is where the structural logic reasserts itself. The USMCA treaty, which all three countries signed, contains no provision requiring concessions before the review process begins. The review is not a renegotiation triggered by crisis. It is a scheduled, treaty-mandated process to demand concessions before allowing the treaty's own review mechanism to function is to demand that the other party surrender the process before the process starts. That's not negotiation. That's capitulation dressed up as a precondition. And every trade lawyer in Ottawa, Washington, and Mexico City knows it. In the next 30 days, Marie in Windsor is going to feel this story in very specific ways. If Canada holds its position and the Advisory Council successfully activates the U.S. private sector lobby, there is a scenario, not certain but plausible, where the administration feels enough domestic business pressure to allow formal USMCA talks to begin without additional Canadian concessions. In that scenario, Marie's plant has a cleaner supply chain horizon. Investment decisions get made. Overtime gets authorized. The break room conversation shifts from anxiety to cautious optimism. In the second scenario, and this is the one keeping trade ministers up at night, the administration, facing domestic pressure and unable to show a win on any trade front, escalates, Not with more tariffs necessarily, but with what Goodale called the constant churn, more ambiguity, more reinterpretations, more midnight rule changes that land without warning on factory floors in Windsor and Sault Ste. Marie. In that scenario, Marie's employer makes the call that every CFO eventually makes when the regulatory environment is too unstable. They shift investment south of the border, where the rules are at least predictably bad rather than randomly bad. The political map in Canada is already shifting. Carney's election was, in significant part, a referendum on this trade fight. He won because Canadians wanted a government that would not flinch. That mandate is a resource, but it is not infinite. If the economic pain continues without visible progress, the political coalition that delivered that mandate starts to fracture, starting with the provincial premiers who are managing their own restless electorates. Premier Canu in Manitoba can keep the American bottles off the shelves as long as his voters support it. That support is durable, but not unconditional. At the systemic level, what this story is really about is whether USMCA survives as a functional trade architecture or becomes a historical footnote. Because if the United States can selectively violate a trade agreement it signed, impose sectoral tariffs that contradict its own treaty obligations, and face no binding legal consequences, then the agreement is not an agreement, it's a suggestion. And every country watching this, every country that is being asked to sign a new trade deal, join an American-led economic framework, or trust U.S. treaty commitments, is watching whether Canada gets away with saying no or gets crushed for it. The precedent set in this fight is not bilateral, it is global. But here is what this story is really about. It is not about bourbon on Manitoba shelves. It is not about the July 1st deadline. It is about whether a democratic ally with a formal treaty relationship, a deeply integrated economy, and a shared history can maintain its economic sovereignty when the most powerful country in the world decides to use trade as a weapon. That question does not have a polite answer. Marie in Windsor is going to find out the answer before the economists finish writing their papers about it. If formal USMCA talks begin, with no additional Canadian concessions under the treaty's own terms, Marie's world stabilizes. Not fixed, not perfect, but stable enough to plan. Stable enough for her employer to sign the next contract cycle with confidence. Stable enough that the break room conversation changes. If the talks don't begin, if the deadline passes, the uncertainty tax compounds, and the Advisory Council's mobilization effort fails to move the U.S. private sector, then Marie is facing a different calculation. Her employer is not evil, they are rational, and rational companies do not make long-term investments in jurisdictions where the rules change at midnight without notice. Notice what Prime Minister Carney has not said. He has not named a number. He has not floated a concession. He has not indicated a line below which Canada will not go. That silence is strategic. In a negotiation where the other side is running on chaos and disruption, the worst thing you can do is give them a target. So Canada is presenting a wall, flat, featureless, impossible to get traction on. The administration keeps looking for the edge to push against, and they keep finding nothing to push. The moral stakes stripped of all jargon. One country built something with its neighbor over 40 years. It's called a partnership, and the neighbor is now using a hammer on the parts it built together and asking why the other side won't just hand over the tools. Here's the final twist. The alcohol ban that Greer and Lutnick are screaming about, it's not even the biggest Canadian lever. It's the one they chose to use first, because it's visible, it's immediate, and it generates the exact kind of outrage you see this week. Canada has other tools: energy, rare earth supply chains, border cooperation on fentanyl interdiction, intelligence sharing architecture that the U.S. depends on far more than it publicly acknowledges. The alcohol ban is the warning shot. And if Washington doesn't understand that, the next few months are going to be very educational. If this breakdown helped you see what the headlines are not telling you, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because in this space, the story is never the press conference. It is the document filed quietly the day after. It is the executive who changed their capital allocation table without telling anyone. It is the meeting that happened in a hotel lobby that no camera was in. That's where this trade fight is actually being decided, and we track every move. The question for the comments, and I want you to answer this, not just read past it, is Canada being strategically patient or dangerously stubborn? Drop your answer below. Both positions are defensible. I want to see which side this audience lands on.